a separate episode, we talked about the way theological disputes and issues shape the definitions and perceptions of the church. Theology, while important, played only a partial role in the evolving understanding of the church. The government of the time and politics also had a major impact. One of the biggest political moments in the early centuries of the Christian church was the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, making Constantine the first Roman emperor to be a convert to Christianity. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, a declaration that no longer made it a crime to be Christian. This created a culture of toleration across the Roman Empire that allowed Christianity to expand and flourish. By 380, Christianity was the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was a major moment in Christian history because for the first time, the authority of a government, specifically the Roman Empire, rested behind the Christian church. The significance of this shift was found in a change in the church's authority. No longer was the church's authority limited to what we call the sacerdotium, that would be the sacraments and spiritual care. With the support and backing of the government came additional governmental and political responsibilities. And as Christian leaders found themselves within a secure government and part of the political structure, the church began to mimic the governmental structure of the empire. In other words, the church leadership evolved into a hierarchy. The adaptation of a hierarchical leadership structure led to an understanding that religious offices derived their authority from above. In other words, they were ordained by God and not sanctioned by the community. This is a significant contrast to Paul. Recall, Paul claimed his authority rested in the letters of reference written on the hearts of those he was preaching to. One of the consequences of combining the religious structures and offices with the power of the empire is that temporal, meaning earthly or secular, and spiritual oversight became institutionalized. And as that happened, it marked the beginning of a long history of competing powers for the oversight of the institution. Because in any hierarchy, someone always claims to be on top. At the outset, there was little doubt about who was on top of the power structure. The Roman emperor was the highest authority. Along with temporal responsibilities, he convened the church councils, which made up the rules that governed the spiritual institution. That meant that as the Roman emperors championed Christianity, temporal authority was mixed in with spiritual regulation, and distinctions between those two realms became blurred. One of the results of the mixing of these two realms, temporal and spiritual, was that anyone having sacerdotal authority, namely the clergy, automatically began to wield temporal influence. In other words, clergy had influence well beyond their pastoral responsibilities. So decisions at spiritual events, such as the major ecumenical councils, were extremely important on both spiritual and temporal or secular levels. With important decisions looming at church councils and within Christian communities, competition for authority and power occurred. A consistent question was, who could make decisions for the Christian community? Of greatest concern was the need to have a unified set of Christian beliefs, and thus a consistent Christian confession. As issues of faith arose, declarations, judgments, and decisions across the Christian community lacked consistency. Why? Because during this time, the local bishops were responsible for determining whether or not a person could be readmitted to the community and the sacraments. That meant there was no consistent standard or application of rules in those local communities. That lack of consistency meant that people sought a universal court of appeals. Over time, that authority shifted to the Bishop of Rome. It eventually became standard practice that important matters be presented to the Bishop of Rome. This shift can be seen over the centuries as the Bishop of Rome claimed more authority and influence on the broader Christian community. For example, under Pope Leo I, who was pope from 440 to 461, the authority and power of the Roman bishop was strengthened. Leo was actually the first to use the title Pontifex Maximus, meaning chief priest, basically, and the first to assert that the spiritual power of the Pope was superior to the worldly power of the emperor. Note, though, that even though Pope Leo made that claim to world power, it would not come to full fruition for centuries. And while that was the case, the impact of the decree was significant. We can see two results from Pope Leo's assertion of the superiority of his spiritual power to the worldly power of the emperor. The first result was that it detached clergy from the worldly order and jurisdiction. In other words, it meant that clergy were under the supervision of the Pope and not the emperor. That in turn meant that government regulations, such as taxes and other secular laws, did not pertain to clergy. In a sense, today we would say the clergy had diplomatic immunity. The second result of Pope Leo's claim to the title Pontifex Maximus is that it contributed to the investiture controversy. That controversy basically boiled down to the question of who had the right to appoint or crown. Was it the Pope or the Emperor? That specific controversy came to bear fully under Pope Gregory VII, it was from 1020 to 1085, prohibition of lay investiture in the year 1076. Pope Gregory issued a decree that only clergy could appoint and ordain clergy, not the emperor. This meant that the emperor no longer had the power to choose the pope. As the centuries passed and as the church acquired more authority, there was a growing need for all of the rulings, decisions, and church bureaucracy to be standardized. There actually came a point in approximately 1140 that all the church laws, legal decisions, and secular verdicts by the bishops and church councils were compiled into one place, something called Gratians Decretum. This actually functioned to give the church a set of its own common law. A century later, in approximately 1227, Gregory IX brought together all of the papal decrees and codified them, establishing an even more corporate concept of the church. The result was the even firmer establishing of the canon law. A way to describe the canon law is to draw the analogy of the legal system of a secular government. The church's canon law functions in a way that is very similar to the laws and constitution of a nation. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church actually still has lawyers who specialize in the canon law. As the canon law grew in scope and influence, so also did the role of local clergy in society, not only on the spiritual level, but also on the secular level. To be a member of the clergy meant not only did you play a role in people's relationship with God, you also played a role in secular politics. The culmination of temporal power came about when the papacy became a separate monarchy. In other words, the papacy became a government and still is recognized as such today, the Vatican. As its own government, the Vatican actually issues its own passports, has its own land, and is even served by its own army to this day, the Swiss Guard. And as all this happened, the need for centralized power and bureaucracy also increased. The power of the papacy was formally marked by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. That council centralized the power of the Pope and formally declared that the Church, governed by the papacy, was uniquely the Congregatio Fidelium, the gathering of the faithful. Moreover, the council put forth the profession of faith in the visible, sacramental, and Eucharistic community found in Rome, outside of which no one is saved. In other words, they declared that there can be no salvation outside of the Roman Catholic Church, something that is still part of Roman Catholic understanding. The march toward more power for the papacy continued with a papal bull or declaration issued by Boniface VIII titled Unum Sanctum from 1302. With it, the papacy claimed two powers, temporal and spiritual, declaring that the temporal is under the control of the spiritual. In other words, this papal bull held that it is necessary to submit to the Roman pontiff in order to be saved. Further, the bull asserted that Christ and the Pope are one head of the spiritual body. We know this is a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time, but one of the big takeaways for you is that the politics between the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constance ushered in an enormous amount of change in the structure and the governance of the institutional church body. The power, authority, and structure of the Roman Catholic Church grew and solidified tremendously. But in regard to the interpretation of the marks of the Church, one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, little, if anything, changed through the Middle Ages.